Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 23 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm here with Curt today, and we're going to hit a really important topic of trauma and autism. To do this, I invited a good friend of mine, Kristy Chambers from the Columbus Community Center in Salt Lake, Utah, to join us today. I was able to tour her beautiful facility last year as part of a training trip I took out to Utah, and was really just blown away with the facility and the work Columbus Community Center does. And knowing Kristy from other endeavors where our paths crossed, know she's just doing some amazing work out there. And as part of that invitation, Kristy brought two other great experts to this table, Safia Keller and Dr. Douglas Goldsmith are with us also today. So we'll give them a chance to introduce themselves a little bit more officially here. But Curt, I just want to ask you, because I know you're also provide some expertise in this area as well. So I just kind of wanted to start us out, to connect our readers to the topic of just kind of what has been your experience with trauma and autism over the years in your professional work.
Yeah, being trained as a board certified behavior analyst, that's really a lot of where you find people with my credential in doing ABA in the autism space. And certainly over the years, I have found such an application of trauma-informed principles for people on the spectrum, across from children, families, adults, you name it. And we just kind of look, I think one of the first questions I would really love to get people's input on it, and I'll ask that here in a minute, but really was I thought about it when I read things like the ACEs questionnaire and what people are asking questions about. People on the autism spectrum experience those a lot. Just as a function of their disability and their place in the world. And so that really has created just that simple question of asking what's happened to you has been an important professional development for me. I think yesterday I was doing a presentation and even asked kind of was explaining to this group that one of my most important professional development moments has been when I quit trying to do my job so hard that I could just shut up and listen. Mm-hmm. And that's been an important thing for me, to just ask the right question and be able to connect with people's experience and understand what they've been through. And I think that it's, is equally as important, if not more, in the field of autism as it is in any other endeavor of intervention and connection with people.
Absolutely.
So that certainly has been my experience with it.
Absolutely. And I bring, a little bit as well as, it's kind of, I was thinking about, okay, how did I get into this arena? And basically the answer to that is, as kind of my career has just been this free flow of consciousness in and out of these different areas, is I was hired without a whole lot of expertise. I had a lot of building expertise with children, but to run the day-to-day operations of a school of what we labeled at the time dually diagnosed developmentally disabled children. So basically that meant there was an IQ under 80 and mental health issues made it to where their behavior was too violent for public school systems. So from the Colorado perspective, if you can imagine a kid that burns out every resource of a big district like Denver public school systems, that was our baseline kid. And most, I'd say about 80% of those kids were on the autistic spectrum in one way or the other. And the thing that I'm really excited about today's topic, and I hope our listeners, even if this may not be something that you work with on a day-to-day basis, those kids taught me so much. I think the as I was just starting to learn about trauma, and I think autism seemed to be in some ways like trauma was, it was really at its infancy in some ways, our understanding is the severe traumatic brain injuries, the severe psychological trauma that the kids had experienced. It was at such an extreme that it taught me the lessons at the extreme that I could then take back later on in my career with maybe less extreme cases around working with nonverbal kids, again, kids that had really trouble around language processing, sensory integration. I mentioned a couple times on this podcast, it's where I became a big fan of occupational therapy as an intervention. And then I met people like Curt too, and they seem to be very nerdy like me. So I really enjoyed that as well. So like I said, even if this isn't a topic you might think about every day, really encourage you to stay tuned, because again, there's so many lessons to learn, and I'm excited to get to our experts as well. So Kristy, I'm going to throw it over the Rocky Mountains to you, my friend, to introduce yourself, give us a little bit more information about the great work Columbus Community Center is doing, and to sort of start the introductions of our experts as well.
Sure. Well, Matt, thank you so much for this opportunity. And it's just delightful seeing you. We've always had just a nice friendship over the course of time. So this is really an honor and a privilege for us to be able to do this. So I'm Kristy Chambers, and I'm the CEO with Columbus Community Center. And Columbus Community Center has been around for 50 years, and we are a large disability provider. We do a wide range of services, including residential services and scattered sites. We provide vocational training. We also are an employer, so we have about 200 employees with more significant disabilities who work in our setting. And we also do supported employment, supported living. So it's a multifaceted agency that has been around for 50 years. The fun part for me has been that we are translating all of these expertise into the world of autism. And hence the meeting today and really exploring that. We've been able to pull together really a brain trust of experts here in Utah to help us understand what that's going to look like in providing services to this growing need of young adults on the autism spectrum who are aging out of the school system. We call it the service cliff, where basically they no longer have the structured supports, and they're launched into adulthood. And we really see ourselves filling that space of providing the necessary vocational training as well as living opportunities to fully integrate people into the community. So we have been embarking on some really significant program work in this area in providing the necessary training and tools and skill sets, both social and occupational, to get people working out there in the community. And one of the best things about my job is we are being very innovative in that we are building an apartment complex that's going to be 156 units of affordable housing, but 16 of those units are going to be dedicated to a live-work solution for young adults on the autism spectrum. And we will be housing our Next Work Academy there as well, and that will be large space to do the vocational training that's necessary to do that. So stay tuned, because we really think it's going to be a national example that we hope to replicate in many other settings. So we're very excited about that.
I saw the plans for it looks beautiful.
Well, and it is. It really is. And we will be breaking ground on that end of March, early April, and then it will be
so exciting.
It'll be occupied by December 2019, and we really have engaged the entirety of our community in order to make this happen. Everything from the state legislature to the county to using the housing authority experts to pull together all the financing through LIHTC and new market tax credits. So it is of a monumental proportion and will be an example in many different settings, not only the autism setting. So thank you for allowing me that plug.
Absolutely.
The best part, well, really the exciting piece of this is we've been able to draw in a brain trust of people on experts in autism in every area from the University of Utah. I'm going to introduce Dr. Goldsmith here shortly. Safia is an employee of ours, and I'll share with you all of the wonderful accomplishments that she has achieved over the brief time that she's been with us, which is almost 2 years now. But let me go into the bios, and I think that'll give us a good introduction. So Dr. Douglas Goldsmith joins us today. He is the Executive Director of the Children's Center, a private nonprofit agency devoted to helping families with preschoolers who have behavioral and emotional problems. Dr. Goldsmith received his master's degree from Vanderbilt University and his doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Utah in 1988. Dr. Goldsmith has worked with preschoolers and their families for over 30 years and has lectured across the state of Utah on trauma and attachment. He is particularly well known for his work on applying attachment theory in clinical practice. Along with his colleague, Dr. David Oppenheim from the University of Haifa in Israel, they have created the annual Bridging the Gap Symposium in Salt Lake City that is devoted to helping clinicians learn to utilize attachment theory in clinical practice. In addition, they have co-edited a book on the application of attachment to clinical practice and was published by Guilford in the spring of 2007. Dr. Goldsmith successfully gained 2 federal grants, making the Children's Center a partner of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network for 7 years. During that time, he has been a leader of the effort to bring trauma-informed practice to clinicians throughout the state. In fact, for the past 3 years, Dr. Goldsmith and his staff have provided training to clinicians in every local mental health authority across the state in order to ensure access to evidence-based trauma treatment for families with traumatized children. He has expertise in working with children under the age of 8 exposed to trauma, including children with autism. So we've got a real expert here. And then Safia, as I mentioned, has been with us for 2 years. She has grown our programs exponentially. I can't even tell you, I don't know how she's done it all in the 2 years' time, but she came in very early and wrote a grant that allowed us $600,000 to do something called Columbus Connects. So we connect people, families and individuals to employment here, and that's been funded by VR and has taken off. Also, she has been at the foundation of our formative program Next Work, which is specifically tailored to young adults on the autism spectrum to do such skills as SketchUp, Digitability, which is a program whereby you create your resume and put yourself out there and market yourself to employers. We also have programs that help with social skills and like, so Safia oversees that. She came in as a department of 1 and is now a department of 10, so imagine that in 2 years. But let me give you just a little bit more background on Safia, because not only does she bring these lovely expertise, but she's also a community leader. So Safia is the Chief Employment Development Officer at Columbus Community Center. Safia comes to Columbus with 10 years of experience in fundraising and 11 years of experience in sales and program creation. She worked at Westminster Colleger as the Director of Corporate Relations for 10 years, and prior to that was the Group of Corporate Sales Director for 12 cities of Broadway across America for 11 years. She received her BA in International Affairs from the University of Colorado Boulder. She is a member of the Rotary Club of Salt Lake City and is the current chair of the Utah Women's Giving Circle and is part of the Community Foundation of Utah. She sits on several boards in the community, including AFP, which is a Utah chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and the Salt Lake Rotary Foundation, and the University of Utah Ski Archive. So she's a big skier as well. But most importantly, and why she is here today, is she is the mother of McLean Keller, who is a 22-year-old and light of her life, but she experiences autism firsthand as a parent. And we were able to coax her over here, which was, as you can know, with all of these qualifications, we're incredibly grateful, but this is also personal to her because she sees this as a means by which she can improve the life of her son. That has been very important to her over the course of the last 22 years. So there you have it.
Very cool. All right, we're locked and loaded to go. So let me ask a really complex question to start us off. And I want to, this may sound, and you can laugh at me for starting out this simple, but autism has always been an interesting, I guess, phenomenon, for lack of a better word, is, as somebody who's trained as a mental health therapist, we're given the DSM with all those diagnoses in it. And most diagnoses seem to be sort of like things like depression, for example, is there was sort of something that happened, depression sort of hit, there could be some genetic things in there, and then treatments implemented, and then the depression hopefully has been taken care of in some ways. If you wouldn't use maybe the word cured, it doesn't mean it couldn't come back like a cold, but a lot of the mental health diagnoses seem in that way. To me, autism seemed like a very, very different thing when I entered the field, is that this was sort of speaking to who the kids were. And again, and something that I thought was, I just found them incredibly fascinating in so many different levels, but very different than some of the other diagnoses out there. So I just want to start out with the very ingenious question that I came out with. And maybe Dr. Goldsmith, you could start us out with this, is what the heck is autism?
That is a big question. Starting point. I think what's great is that we've now moved toward talking about autism spectrum.
Yeah.
We appreciate that there are many, many different versions of autism. And I tell people that if the secretary called me at work and said, the next child you're going to see has autism spectrum, I don't know what that child's going to look like. And I think that's really important, that people appreciate that these are children with a diverse level of skills. We have high functioning children, we have children that are struggling in many different levels, but we really need to understand that child and not strive to understand the diagnosis. Who is that child in the context of their own world?
Beautiful. So if you were to see, and totally, I love that answer, totally agree with you. If you were just to have let's just say I'm going to just throw a random child in front of you, what would be some of the characteristics where you would say, okay, this kid might be on that spectrum that you speak of? What are some of the real key things that you look for to sort of kind of establish that they are on somewhere, at least on that spectrum?
I think that's also a good question, because in today's world, autism has become so prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
We see people, I've talked to families that are in Costco, and people walk up to them and say, I think maybe your child has autism. We have school teachers saying, maybe this child has autism. And oftentimes what they've seen is one symptom. And sometimes that's about sensory issues. Your child seems really upset by loud noises, he must have autism. Autism is much more complicated than that. When we look at the really critical central characteristic, these are just children who have trouble socially. They don't read cues as well as their non-autistic peers. They do find the environment overwhelming, and we've got to be very sensitive to that. That's like an adult sitting in a room where it's too cold, it's too noisy, there's background stuff going on, there's somebody clicking a pen, and even as adults would go, this is making me crazy, I can't sit here anymore.
Yeah.
And we have to appreciate that that's sort of the life for these kids. And they have wonderful skills, but we get upset because they don't like to play with other children the way we'd like to see them play. And yet parents will come in and say, but he plays beautifully with his brother or sister, and that's fine. So people need to really understand it is a number of characteristics that we have to look at, not one or two little pieces of information.
Beautifully said. Absolutely.
One of the answers I've gotten from interviewing a lot of people on the spectrum that's pretty interesting is I've heard it described. A young kid said this to me one day when I said, what's it like for you? And he looked at me and he said, well, have you ever had autism? I said, well, no, tell me what it's like. And he said, and I've got this answer consistently several times now, that it's like watching two video screens simultaneously, where one world is reality, where I can control nothing, and I can't predict anything that happens. I can't interpret any of the cues that happen, and I can't anticipate what's going to happen. And another world that is my fantasy world. And I'm watching these two screens all the time. And I want to be in my fantasy world because I can control everything. I can make everything predictable. I can make everybody do what I want them to do. And in this other world, I can't do that. I can't navigate it. So that was something that kind of helped me to understand, as I'm essentially trying to help a child or an adult to navigate this world that they don't want to be in, and they don't want to feel, they don't feel comfortable in. And I'm slowly trying to pull them out of this internal world where everything can be controlled and interact more with the external world. Pretty interesting answer that I've gotten now several times, that's a consistent experience.
No, I think that is interesting. It's also like Temple Grandin talking about thinking in pictures.
Yeah.
And, I think that's also something really important for us to understand is the different ways of communicating. And that when we say boat to these children, they're literally going through photos in their head to try to figure out what are you talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's also important, there was a great article years and years ago by children with Asperger's that were in high school. And they said, why does everyone keep trying to change us? Our brains think differently, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And one of my why I loved working with these kids so much is I really realized early on, and again, we had the severity of the behaviors and a lot of other things. On top of it is I needed to learn how to play their game the way they want to play it. And I thought that was with each kid, there was a different sort of, like if I went in and just wanted to play a simple board game with a kid, I'd come in, well, here's the rules, here's the structure. And when I started to learn about, I need to let them teach me from kind of that other screen Curt was talking about. I love that explanation you've gotten. That they taught me how they wanted to play the game. And when we started as a staff to take the time to learn how they played the game and how they kind of saw it, it really changed our whole approach to working with this kid. And it was just a beautiful experience to be a part of as well. That I really, to this day, just hold as one of the best professional experiences I've ever really been a part of. I'd like to see if Safia has any other, from her perspective of, kind of this may be a loaded question in some ways with your variety of experience, but when you hear the question, what is autism? What does that sort of resonate with you from your experience and background?
So McLean just thinks and processes information differently than neurotypical people, so people without autism. And now that he's 22 and is verbal, is able to express what it was like when he was younger. And just recently, he's been able to tell me what certain experiences were like. And it's been incredibly eye-opening to me. One particular experience, we were flying on an airplane, and he was 5 or 6, and we were flying back from California, and we were very near the engine in our seats. And from when the plane took off, basically till when we landed, he was very upset and crying and scared. And now he's able to, and I thought it was just because it was loud, because he is very sensitive to noises. And now he has been able to tell me that he thought that there were bears outside on the wing, and that he was in imminent danger, that he was going to be hurt by these large bears that were out on the wing making this noise. So, and other experiences, he has become an amazing artist. He can draw things that are stunning in the detail. And my dad has always been fascinated by this. And he said, McLean, how do you draw these pictures? And he said, well, it's the picture I see in my head. Mm-hmm. So he, Temple Grandin's book, Thinking in Pictures, he always, whenever he draws, it is the picture that he sees in his head. So, and he has learned to embrace his autism, and in whether we're in a social situation, and if somebody makes the mistake of saying something to him in a derogatory fashion, whether he's stimming, which is to take an object, and with McLean, it's usually a pen, a wooden spoon, or a whisk, and he does this. Mm-hmm. So if he's doing that in public, or if he's talking to himself in public, often he recites Disney movies verbatim, and sometimes people say, what are you doing? You're acting strangely, and he says very proudly, well, I'm autistic, and my brain operates differently, and I'm really smart, and I'm a really good artist, and I'm doing this because it makes me feel better, which I love. And then the people just immediately are like, oh, okay. And it just kind of shuts them down because he is able to verbalize that. But I feel for individuals with autism who aren't able to verbalize that and who aren't able to express that, because it can be very distressing.
Absolutely. And I mentioned this, and I talk about this in my trainings, usually to audiences that aren't specializing this, but I learned so much that if I'm not able to express that I'm angry, that's where we see these behaviors come out. And what we know for even, so for the nonverbal kids I worked with, it's just like, I really got to appreciate how frustrating it is not to be able to say, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm happy. And sometimes happy was better than sad or frustrating, because usually it did end up in some behavior that might get somebody hurt. But it taught me so much about that expressive language capacity. And as I talk to my other audiences, as we talk about trauma outside the autistic spectrum, as well as damage to the Broca's area, or that expressive areas of the brain, is even very verbal kids expressing emotions is an incredibly complex thing. So that was one of the huge lessons taught to me by the population, is I got to give these kids a way to tell me they're pissed off right now. And those little simple things, I think, whether we're talking about, again, kids on the spectrum or kids just struggling with severe trauma, boy, we can't assume that because I can easily tell you I'm frustrated, that's an ability everybody has sort of to assess. So great examples. And Curt, I know you have some questions, so I'm gonna throw it over to you to facilitate the next part of the conversation.
I have lots of questions, actually. I'm kind of deciding which question to go with in my head. Certainly one area I'm really interested in is the idea of relational interventions in autism spectrum disorder. And I'm so happy to have this audience to be talking about this with. And I'll kind of set it up a little bit with a study that I think is really, really an important one. And it was a study done by a woman named Wendy DeAndrea. She's a student of Bessel van der Kolk. She came out of that place in Boston. She's in New York now. I think she's still there. So she did a study, and she had two groups of individuals in her study. One was a group of individuals on the autism spectrum, and the other was a group of children who had experienced adverse childhood experiences or who had a trauma. And she gave them both the reading the mind and the eyes test, which is for those who don't know, it's a way of looking at facial expressions and specifically at the eyes and inferring internal states or emotions and putting a label to that. And that's the test. And you go through several trials of that, and you get a multiple choice selection at the end of each trial to say, given this set of eyes, what's the emotion that you would label given those set of eyes? Well, she found that kids, obviously we would think that children diagnosed with autism would have deficits in that area. She found that kids who had experienced adverse childhood experiences had more deficits. They actually performed worse than kids on the autism spectrum, which I thought was fascinating. And that was the time when I was treating children from the child welfare system here in Colorado, and they're extremely traumatized as a group. And I thought, as a behavior analyst, well, we have all kinds of intervention to teach this. We have all kinds of intervention to help with this problem for children on the autism spectrum. Why don't we apply this in the world of trauma as well? And so that was something that I thought a lot about, which really drove me to learn much more about relational interventions, about attachment. So I'm so happy to be able to ask Dr. Goldsmith this question. Like, when we think about attachment in children on the autism spectrum, I think there's a lot of kind of thinking out there that you can't do relational interventions with kids on the spectrum. And so I would love to get your take on that, and I'm just excited to hear it.
Well, for a long time, the thinking about autism was these are children that don't have relationships. And actually, my colleague, Dr. David Oppenheim in Israel, was one of the first to evaluate, do children with autism have secure relationships with parents, which is the cornerstone of attachment. In the typical population, we find that about 80% of children have secure relationships, which is very important. It tells us that you have to do a lot to knock them off the secure base. When they looked at children with autism, which was the first study to do so, they found that over 50% of the children have secure relationships with their parents, which is very important. And that means that when the child is feeling stressed or upset or is hurt, that they're going to go to the parent for help and support. So this notion that they don't have relationships, we know, is really a very old notion, and it's not true. When we apply that then to trauma, one of the things that has become confused about trauma, and this is still quite a new field, of only a little over a decade old, is our goal with treatment is not to take away trauma. We can't ever do that. And we know that from the ACEs study. It stays inside of us. It's about learning how to cope with trauma. And certainly children are able to do that. One of the things that we find out, which is very sad, is that probably the number one trauma for children struggling with autism is being bullied. They are being teased, they are being harassed at school. And that is the number one issue that studies are reporting, that they come home with, feeling devastated by the teasing and the taunting. And certainly that deserves a relational response, an understanding response from a teacher, or certainly from their parent. Our concern with the teachers and what's happening in the schools is that when children go and complain, whether they're autistic or whether they are typical, teachers say, go deal with it, go away, ignore him. None of those are helpful responses to children on the spectrum.
Yes, certainly I have found, I'll give you a little, hopefully a short story. In a residential setting, I've done this in classrooms as well, really shifting the hypothesis that we use to drive intervention becomes really important. So we hear these words, attention-seeking behavior, a lot, right? And that's a hypothesis for why this behavior is happening, which drives intervention. And that intervention often becomes ignore it, right? If it's attention-seeking, you must ignore it to solve the problem. Well, when in the situation you just described, you really have described, I think, the difference between what is co-regulation and what is self-regulation. And a child often will come to a caregiver and admit many annoying things in an attempt to regulate with that caregiver. And then the caregiver sends them away because they're annoyed and they want to regulate. And so they send the child away to self-regulate, and the child doesn't have that ability. So we shifted that one time. I'll give you some data from a residential unit where we had our staff start to say, when the child would ask for things over and over and over again that they couldn't have, and they'd get frustrated and go, you need to go to your room and think about it, to say, I can't give you any of those things right now. I'm really sorry, but here's what I need you to do. Stay next to me. I got to go do my job. I got to go do my checks. I got to go walk around, but I need you to be right on my hip. Don't go anywhere. And that took the number of, our key measure here was any emergency intervention we had to do. So any child who did something that was so dangerous that we had to put our hands on them to stop it. That was our measure. And it took that number of events in 1 month from 40 to 4 by doing that intervention. And that was really changing the hypothesis that we used for why that behavior was occurring. And I wonder, certainly, Safia, from your perspective, and Dr. Goldsmith from yours, are there areas, is that a common thing that you're seeing as well in the worlds that you're in, where you hear these hypotheses getting generated about why a symptom is happening or why a behavior is occurring, and that drives an intervention going in a direction that we could do a better job of?
So I'm just going to speak from my experience as a mom and with what McLean has experienced. And bullying was a huge issue for McLean. Not so much in his elementary school years. He always refers to his elementary school and those years as the glory years. And he was very fortunate to be in a great public school with a wonderful program. But it was when he got into junior high and high school where the bullying began. And I'm so glad that he felt comfortable enough with me to come home and tell me about it, because I was one to go immediately to the school, to the principal, and say, this stops now. This ends today. He cannot defend himself. He's not able to process and help himself like other kids. And I said, and frankly, no one should be bullied at the school, but especially these kids with special needs. So, but for kids who don't have a parent or a caregiver who is able to stop that, I would imagine that the consequences would be devastating. McLean has 2 comorbidities. So his primary diagnosis is autism. He has a secondary diagnosis of ADHD, and then depression and anxiety. And often it is not his autism, which is crippling to him in social situations in society. It is his anxiety. Yeah. And sometimes it can be what is stopping him from able to hold down a job and to function in a normal social situation. And I would imagine that bullying, and I know that bullying just increases that anxiety.
Absolutely. That
Yeah.
makes perfect sense, right? Those 2
Yeah.
events are tied together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Goldsmith and have him answer that.
So that's an important segue to the anxiety part. When we're looking at trauma, as I think people are becoming very aware, we have to understand trauma triggers, which even for the general population with trauma, people will say, oh, it was a trigger. Well, it's not that obvious. Triggers are kind of invisible. We discover them later when we think about our behavior and go, I wonder if there was a connection there. And I was working with a mother last month who was at a big public event with her child, and he became very agitated and started to hurt one of his younger siblings. And the immediate response for any of us is, I'm going to punish you. You may not do that. I've told you not to be aggressive. And later on, just as Safia has talked about, we hear some insights from the children. This was a traumatized child, and he was frightened that mom was going to leave him. And so the motive behind the aggressive behavior was not, I just feel like being a bad boy right now. The motive was, I need to get closer to you because I'm afraid you're going to leave. This is a crowd. I'm very nervous. And so this is, I think, a huge challenge for caregivers. And this doesn't matter if we have, typical children or children with autism, trying to understand what is the motive behind the child's behavior. Mm-hmm. At the Children's Center, the cornerstone of one of our treatments is that we talk to parents about following your child's lead. Don't try to direct it. And especially with children on the spectrum, we'll initially hear from the parents, I don't want to get into his world. It's a frightening world to me. I don't want to do that. But when we really sit with the child and we follow their behaviors, the child for the first time can feel understood. And so this isn't about, can we sit down and process and have lengthy stories about it? It's about saying, I'm here and you're safe and I'll take care of you, giving children a safe place to go in schools when they're starting to feel upset. If we can figure out those triggers, which are very, very difficult, and they're never obvious, which is even more frustrating, that's really what leads to healing of the trauma with these children.
Awesome. If I could ask kind of a follow-up question on this topic. This is really fascinating to me. And one of the things that I really never had a clear answer for in my work. And, again, I was kind of waking up to the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study at the time. Again, autism seemed to be sort of in its infancy, at least from a neurobiological perspective, when I was in the field around 2001 to 2003. one of the things I'd love to get your thoughts on, and if this is just a dumb question, you can throw it away, but so many of my kids came from horrific traumatic backgrounds. I don't even like to think of the stories, especially the nonverbal kids. I mean, the range of trauma during early development with sexual abuse, severe neglect, physical abuse. I mean, just what these kids had gone through from, you know, maybe even before birth, but definitely birth through those really early formative years until the abuse made somebody's radar and action was taken was just horrific. Other kids, maybe a little bit less, but I always kind of wondered this, and I'm interested to see what you know from the research and your own experiences. Can that sort of severe trauma cause autism? Is there a causal effect? Because you know, we know that as we're talking about that, you know, being autistic sometimes opens you up to vulnerabilities. I saw with my kids the bullying for sure, but also I was really worried about sexual assault and other things, people taking advantage of them as well. But I just kind of wanted to get your opinion of these kids I saw come out of this severe trauma and then we get an autistic diagnosis or be on the spectrum later on. Just if there's any research out there to say that there might be some causal effect in some way between trauma and autism.
Well, if we go back to the 60s, Bruno Bettelheim said refrigerator moms caused autism. The workforce, and they were cool and distant, and therefore the child retreated as a defense to this refrigerator mother. Fortunately, we've realized that that was completely wrong. When we look at autism, I think one of the difficulties is, if we look across the world at labs that say, I found the autism gene, they all point to a different gene. And I think that that's part of what is confusing, is that if it was one gene, every single child with autism would look very, very similar. It would look a very similar presentation. The newer research is really looking at a lot of not only brain issues, and there's a lot of concern about inflammation, and actually recent reports that maybe antibiotics could be a way to hit the inflammation in the brain and make some changes. There's also a lot of gut research, which is very interesting because every single preschool child I see with autism has gut issues. And that's really where a lot of the new research is going in terms of what is happening with the gut and the brain. And we know that there actually is a lot of neurons in the brain and the stomach that communicate. That's what makes us people and makes us human and makes us feel. So there's a lot of research that's coming out, and it would be great if we would spend billions of dollars to figure it out, because then we probably could.
So there's not necessarily, and Curt, I'd love to get your opinion on this too. There's not an easy yes or no to sort of my question whether severe trauma could cause an autism, at least a diagnosis later on.
We don't have any research that would tell us that.
Okay, very fascinating.
Very complex question and a very complex causal question. You talk about the gut-brain research, right? That's such a new area that we're just finding out what we don't know. There is just so much to learn there that, I mean, 10 years from now, we'll be going, what were we thinking 10 years ago? You know, it really is going to be one of those exploding areas of knowledge.
Very cool. And I just want to put out, just to thank my wife, if you're on the video, I got my matched kombucha thing. So I'm thinking a lot about my second brain or gut lately. So I want to just kind of ask a follow-up question, as we've talked about the topic of safety and bullying and, you know, just, you know, again, some of the abuse that happens kid on kid. I think a lot of anxiety I had is, you know, when you had kids that were going through puberty, they'd want to date one another. And, you know, sometimes that went really well. Other times it didn't go so well. And just, I kind of wonder, there's probably 4 people here that think a lot about safety. And when we talk about trauma-informed care, we're always talking about safety. So whether it's, you know, at the Columbus Community Center, which I walked through, and it was just this welcoming, beautiful facility. how do you, when you think about it, how do you create safety for kids that are highly vulnerable? And what are some of your thinking with that? So I just love to get your opinion, because I know a lot of people, whether you're working sometimes in a homeless shelter, in a school environment, we see this vulnerability, and just kind of wondering, how do you look at setting up safe environments where really everybody can thrive? Kristy, what do you have on this for me?
You know, I think it's a function of inclusivity in your environment. We're very fortunate. Our facilities are large and nice, and there's a lot of sunshine, and so they're warm, they're welcoming. Our staff too are trained to make sure that they know how to de-escalate people with behavioral situations. So we have good people doing good work, making it a very safe environment. It's very rare that something elevates itself to my level. So, you know, either I'm not understanding it fully, which of course the day-to-day, the professionals that are in our setting managing these things, again, are trained and know how to do it. So the fact that I'm not hearing a lot about it, I think just is a testament to the fact that we've got good people doing good things. We also invest as an agency in making sure that people have that training. So of course there's credentialing that happens with any frontline staff that you have to go through. Background checks are just, you know, they're part and parcel to what we need to do. So again, inviting the right people into our setting to do this work, training them well, providing the appropriate facilities, areas where people can de-escalate so you can separate people out and have that opportunity to deal with them more one-on-one. We've got the facilities in order to do that. But I think it comes down to your mission, who you are, what you're about. Certainly, I think disabled population, there's a fear of exploitation, and either you're doing it really well and having a good mission-driven organization that is providing a safe environment and inclusivity of the population into the community. And if you really focus on those pieces of it and draw the right people into your setting, then I think it's a beautiful thing. Of course, you do see other settings that maybe aren't as committed to that, and that's where some of the not so pleasant things can happen. We're highly regulated as well, so we have 32 government agencies poking around at us constantly. So there is a lot of regulation in that area to assure that we're providing that environment. But I enjoy coming to work every single day. It is inspirational on every level. You see people happy, you see people smiling, you see people engaging with visitors. You experienced this, Matt, when you came through, people came up to you, they said hello.
Gave a lot of high fives.
You know, that's when the magic happens. So for us, it's just endemic into what we do. The safety piece is critical, and that translates very nicely into doing the mission that we all feel very good about.
Yeah, and it just, as I walk through facilities around the country, again, we talk about sometimes with autism is like, oh, you know, the relationships are difficult, but you walk in a facility like yours and I'm getting mobbed by people. And again, when you're 6'7" and you're freakishly tall anyway, you draw the attention, but it was just, I just loved it. It's like, oh, these people like were coming to me to talk. And again, the high fives all around was just put a smile on my face for the whole trip. So.
And we invite the community into our setting, and people do walk away with that same feeling of this is good, this is right. This is, the world has gotten to be a better place by virtue of all of the legislation that has taken place over the last 50 years. We have achieved integration into the community in living settings and work settings, and we have really increased the quality of life of people with disabilities in profound ways. It really is remarkable when you sit back and think about it. So.
Awesome. Just any other thoughts from everybody else around the importance of safety when we talk about the bullying stuff? Again, maybe for folks that are working with not specifically autistic, people with autism, but maybe running across some of these of what some safety concerns can be for some of our listeners, and how we create great environments for everybody.
I've talked to, because I'm hearing about bullying from all children, not just children with autism. And my wish is that schools would rethink how they're doing recess time. Recess requires an incredible amount of social skill and athletic skill and popularity. And if schools would open their minds and tell children, during recess, you could go to the library and read a book, or you could go to the cafeteria and play a board game, or those of you who are comfortable could go outside and play soccer and give children more options. That would decrease a huge amount of bullying in our schools. The other problem that we have to look at is with the new issue in schools is what are we doing with children going through gender transition? Even in elementary school, we're seeing children at 4 and 5 with this issue and talking about the bathrooms. And I was called in by one of the districts to speak to that issue, particularly with children in transition. And I said, you know, what I frankly find offensive about this conversation is certainly we have to look at those children. This is a big issue. But what about the autistic children who are scared to go to the bathroom because of the automatic toilets, which really frighten them? And so they're withholding all day long, which is causing physical problems. What about the sexually abused child who's going into the bathroom and doesn't feel safe? How can we redesign bathrooms and redesign space to ensure safety for children? Those are all issues that as children grow up, we've really got to focus in on.
Great. Safia, I'd love to just, from your firsthand experience, anything that around the safety issues that maybe you've, again, with some of the struggles that you've had in education and beyond, just wish that were there, or lessons learned along the way from your perspective as well.
So I think it's critical that you let your child know that they can always come to you, whether it's a big thing or a small thing, and tell you, and that there will never be a negative consequence, repercussion. Because if they feel that they can come to you and tell you things that have happened, I mean, there needs to be always someone that they can tell. And McLean has felt that he can come to me and tell me things that have happened. And around the safety issue, I have had encounters with police twice, but they were positive. And one of them was when McLean was a wanderer. He would just walk away from the house. So he was, I would say, 5 or 6 years old, and it was in the summer, and he was in a t-shirt and a diaper. He wasn't fully potty trained till he was older. And I was downstairs doing laundry. My husband was away on a business trip, and it was literally 2 or 3 minutes. And, you know, started looking around for him, gone. Got in the car, started driving around, and then I thought, okay, I need to call 911. So I called 911, and they came, and I said, you know, he's 6. And they said, oh, you know, has he gone to a friend's house? And I said, you don't understand. He's autistic. He has no friends. And at that, you know, moment, stuff started to happen incredibly quickly. Within moments, there were 8 cars and there were sheriffs and the unified police. And they figured out a perimeter. He's how old, how long has he been missing, to the maximum that he could have walked in that amount of time. And basically they just set up this perimeter with cars and on foot and started walking in. And thankfully, about an hour later, and I gave them a picture of him. He was walking across the street, and the police officers looked at the picture, and he said, "Is that your son?" And it was. And he had walked to visit a friend, well, my friend, and it was miles away. And thank God he came back safely. The second time, he had been down playing in a gully in a creek, and some high school boys were down there, and they must have tried to start a conversation. And McLean said, "Oh, I've been kidnapped," and this goes to that fantasy world. I was kidnapped, and I'm now, and I was just let go. And these boys immediately took action and said, "Oh my God, come with us, and we'll go to, the closest store and call 911." So they did all that, and the store they went to was this little neighborhood grocery store, Dave's Shop and Go. Dave knows me. Dave knows McLean. Dave called me to say, "You might want to come down here."
Just as a suggestion, you might want to.
Yeah.
McLean is here, and the police are here. And I don't know what's going on. And I got in my car and I sped down there, and they said, "Who are you?" "I'm his mom." He says he's been kidnapped. And I was like, "Oh my, no, he's autistic." And one of the sheriffs said, oh, my son is autistic. Okay, I get it. And he said, "Come with me." And they got all of his information. They took his photo and they put in their database that McLean, and he was probably 10 at this point, was autistic, and that if he were found, and then they had my phone number and my husband's phone number, he never had any other encounters, but I often wondered if they would have encountered him, would that have been a good safety net, and he would not have been, and I would have been called. I'd like to think that would have happened, but you never know. You see on the news horrific stories and tales of, and it usually tends to be these young men with autism who the police don't understand their behaviors. They don't understand the stimming. They think they're on drugs because they really do act and behave differently. And I know that there have been initiatives. There was one in Salt Lake City that Columbus and Kristy was a big part of before I started here, where there was mandatory training, and a video was made, and it's called Invisible Disabilities. And it was made to train police departments and policemen on the behavior of these individuals with autism. So that to me is a huge concern. The video that I watched on YouTube of the nonverbal autistic man who was African American playing with his little red car in the street, and the caregiver who was prone on his stomach saying, the caregiver was African American, the young man with autism was Caucasian, and the caregiver was pleading, "He's autistic, don't shoot." The policeman shot and was aiming for the man with autism because he thought the toy car was a gun. And thank God he was a bad shot, because he hit the caregiver in the leg, and the man with autism was nonverbal. And that video, that haunts me, because I thought that, there for the grace of God, go McLean.
Yeah, I think anybody that's seen that video had I just saw every kid that I love that I worked with. Yeah. That was me laying down there yelling, and I haven't been in that intense and ridiculous of and just traumatic of a situation, but I understand that. Curt, I know you have one more really, I think, important question to kind of wrap us up with, so I'll hand it over to you for our final question.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all of the literature around effective intervention is really on creating a collaborative relationship across provider disciplines and to collaborate with families. And one of the big benefits I see of a trauma-informed approach is the ability to integrate people and the ability to have a common language and a shared mental model of how the internal world works and how that interacts with the external world. That for me has been a really useful shared language to develop. And I'm wondering, certainly for our guests, have you found the same thing? And how can we use this kind of understanding of the neurobiological and developmental effects of exposure to early childhood trauma as a way to integrate professionals across discipline areas?
I think that's a really important question. I think particularly in the world of autism spectrum disorders, we need a multi-professional approach. We need speech therapists that are helping us understand the children's capacity and increasing that capacity. Critically, we need occupational therapists that can assist us with understanding, which is a bigger and bigger part of their world, how to manage the sensory explosions in their head. Their lives are not easy. And I think also we need therapists that are really trained specifically in autism, adding that, therapists that are trained in trauma, because that's become a very unique skill set. We need pediatricians and often medical management to help adjust these children's lives. And more often, what we're seeing now is all of these kids have huge sleep issues and eating issues, which is required, and we don't even understand where that's come from. None of them are eating anymore. And those really create all sorts of issues in the parent-child relationship. So it really does, in this situation, take a village, especially even adding ABA to that, which has become more and more important. So these are parents that are struggling. And I think as a system, we also need to appreciate that this is a very costly form of treatment. And we're exhausting parents by having them track down 6 professionals a week to try to manage their children. And I think that's a real issue in the field that we're going to have to work on.
Yeah. Safia, from a mother's perspective, I would love to hear your reaction to that kind of a question. I'm sure you've lived it, so I'd love to get your take.
So when McLean, he'll be 23 in a month. So when he developed, I think he has what was referred to as regressive autism. So he developed normally. He hit all his milestones. He sat when he sort of sat, rolled over. He'd acquired language. He was happy, slept well. And at about 20 to 21 months, his vocabulary of about 18 to 20 words. He knew numbers from 1 to 10. He knew about 5 different colors. All of that disappeared. So all of the language that he had acquired was lost. He became withdrawn, angry, aggressive, and this sweet, lovely little boy was gone and was replaced with this other child we didn't know. Autism was never even on the radar. It wasn't discussed. We didn't know what was wrong. And we took him to the children's center. He'd been kicked out of 8 daycares. So we took him to the children's center when he was 3.5. And he had the language of an 18-month-old at 3.5. And he worked with a speech therapist a half hour a day, Monday through Friday, for the next 2 years. And that is, I believe, the only reason he acquired language back again. So and at that same time, all he could do was scribble. When they asked him, even at the age of 5, to draw his family, he just scribbled. He was not able to draw. So we didn't have, the Children's Center now is a fabulous autistic program, preschool. There were no services. There was nothing when McLean was diagnosed, and we were out there on our own on an island. When he was at the Children's Center, he was the only one with autism in his group that he was in. It's a very different landscape now, but I can tell you what I wish there had been. I wish there had been and he did get services with a speech therapist, but I wish there had been what there is now, And there was no support for Lester and I. And it was, it put an incredible strain on our marriage. We went into debt about $70,000 to pay for the children's center and having to have a private nanny. We do it again tomorrow, but there was nothing. I'm so glad to see now that there are services and there is recognition that autism is, and it does take a village. It really does. So
no
so
single
glad.
approach can meet all the needs, right? I mean, there has to be collaboration across professionals.
There has to be, and his pediatrician didn't even see the signs. I think that we need to educate pediatricians because the diagnoses are coming, when they're 3 and 3.5. If they could come earlier and if interventions could start sooner, could the outcomes be better? Right. And I say, yes, I think they could be.
Yep.
So I think we really need to get with the pediatricians because that's who these young children see on a regular basis. Yep. And our pediatrician was fabulous, completely missed all the signs.
Right.
So
it's like the idea of saving early for retirement, right? The earlier you start, the better it's going to be long term, right? So the earlier you can diagnose, the better you can actually adjust the trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was my experience.
It's just, I think shows, again, with whether we have a kid struggling with trauma on the spectrum or not, the need to really rally the professionals around kids as early as possible. Those early childhood intervention programs, pediatricians, educating the educators. So if, I think what your son's so lucky to have, a mom that was sort of on top of it. I know a lot of my parents who were unfortunately also struggling with, when you talk about the debt, but boy, if they were already starting to place in poverty, a lot of my parents had undocumented status. When that mental health issues and maybe some cognitive things of their own, and these kids could sometimes go years without being identified. And boy, as I think we all would agree that when the parents can help identify this early on and get the help, it just really helps change the outcomes. And hopefully, again, as it takes a village to do that. Curt, before we end, any other thoughts before we thank our wonderful guests? This has been just a great conversation.
No, I wanted to say the same and just express my gratitude to all of you for coming on and being willing to tolerate our questions and give us such great insights. I get so energized by talking to people like the three of you, and I'm so appreciative of your time and your insight and your obvious intelligence and compassion. It really is a pleasure, and want to thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to reinforce that. I imagine we'll have maybe a part 2 if you guys would entertain us, maybe sometime in the future to continue this conversation. I just want to thank you all again. We will, as always, have links from we'll get the Columbus Community Center. We'll get links to Dr. Goldsmith's work up on traumainformedlens.org. And Kristy, I know you mentioned a video. Maybe we can put a link up to that as well too.
We would be delighted to share that.
Absolutely. Well, a huge thank you. This has been such a great episode, a topic I was really looking forward. So I want to thank our guest, and like I said, traumainformedlens.org. You can see our videos as well, and we'll just jam that with a whole bunch of resources going into this episode. So again, to our guests, thank you so very much. We really appreciate you all. It's good to know that if a family or child in the Salt Lake City or Utah area has a kid or a young adult that may be struggling with some of the issues we talked about, that they're getting great services. So keep up the amazing work, and I'm sure we'll try to get you all back here before too long. This was a blast.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Take good care.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.